beginning of the session. I really wanted to go to university outside of London. I'm a lifelong Londoner. I grew up in Stepney and Tower Hamlets in East London, and have gradually migrated out east towards Essex. And for those of you who don't know where Ilford North is, my constituency, it's basically the Hainault Loop on the Central Line. Most of that loop is my constituency. So the Sutton Trust gave me the confidence to know that I could apply to Cambridge, that I'd fit in, that someone from a working class background would be welcome at the university. And there's still lots of, even today, I think there's still lots of myths and misconceptions about university generally, Oxbridge specifically. So it gave me that confidence. I'd say though that the biggest drivers in my life and where I've ended up have been family. Well, I don't come from a very wealthy family. I certainly had a strong supportive family network that encouraged me to do well, and a great state education. I went to state school in London, and at the time actually London schools were a sort of byword for educational failure, and so it's not that we had a great education system in London at the time. It was a far cry then from where we are now, but I did have great teachers, and teachers that encouraged me to do well. And I'd say that one of the things about growing up in poverty is that, contrary to what people on the right would have you believe, that you can just sort of pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps, and as long as you work hard, you can kind of lift yourself out of poverty. That's not really how I see it. I see poverty as a trap, and yes, hard work, individual effort is important, but ultimately to escape the trap you need some scaffolding, and the scaffolding in my life included a great state education, council housing, support from my mum, who was a single parent at times, through the benefit system. Those were things that helped my family and helped me to sort of go from where I grew up and the circumstances in which I grew up and the poverty I grew up in to where I am today. So I'm very proud of my kind of working class background. If you listen carefully, you can still hear a slight Cockney East End twang in my accent, although it has changed over the years. But so I'm very proud of my working class roots, but ultimately now I have a very middle class life. And so I wouldn't sort of seek to patronise members of my own family or other people that are growing up in the kind of poverty that I experienced back in the 80s today by, patronising people and saying, oh yeah, here I am, a member of parliament on a salary of over £80,000 a year with a degree from one of the best universities in the world. But yeah, I'm still working class. I'm from a working class background, but I have a middle class life now. And ultimately, what I want to achieve in politics is to make sure that kids don't have to grow up in the same poverty that I experienced, and to make sure that the world of opportunities that is open to people who come from wealthier backgrounds and those who went to private school is available to everyone. And that's kind of my driving motivation in politics.
Okay, so a common feeling of kind of ending up at a top university is imposter syndrome. So is that anything you maybe experienced whilst you're at Cambridge from your background?
So I share an office with the MP for Hove, Peter Kyle, and he just heckled from the other side of the office. No, he's never experienced that. I mean, the truth
LSE was never on for him either.
Just shut up. I think the truth is, look, actually, by the time I got to university, I was pretty precocious actually, and I've got a working class chip on my shoulder, not to the extent that I resent people who are privately educated or come from wealthy backgrounds. That's actually kind of not how I feel. But I've definitely got a working class chip on my shoulder to the extent that my kind of attitude is, if there are opportunities that are open to people from private schools and wealthy backgrounds, those opportunities should be open to me. And by the time I'd got to sixth form, by the time I went to university, I already had a stubborn determination that my kind of class and background wasn't going to hold me back. And I remember going in my first few weeks at Selwyn at Cambridge, having an argument with a friend of mine who went to Harrow, one of the country's top independent schools, and I was kind of busy telling him why I deserved my place more than he did And it wasn't that I thought he didn't deserve his place. What I was trying to say to him is that, and I kind of compared this to a race. So we'd run the same distance around the racetrack, but I had hurdles to cross and to clear. And so in the end, that made me a stronger athlete because I'd cleared the hurdles in order to reach the same destination. And that's the way I kind of look at life, really, and adversity. You know, life will throw obstacles in your way, and it's how you deal with those obstacles that counts. And sometimes you'll get taken down by the hurdles and you won't clear the hurdles. You'll give it a go and you'll fall flat on your face. And those are moments where you have to pick yourself up, dust yourself down and carry on. And you learn something in that. And so, as I said, although I don't want kids to grow up with the same sorts of disadvantages that I had, I also think that some of the experiences I had growing up have been character building, have taught me resilience, have given me kind of tools that have set me up well for life in the end, even if I didn't appreciate it at the time or didn't enjoy it at the time. So yeah, I didn't have imposter syndrome. I don't have imposter syndrome, but you know, I definitely, there are times where you still feel like you don't entirely fit in, or you're surrounded by people with very different backgrounds and very different cultural references. But that's when my kind of working class chip on the shoulder manifests itself.
Okay, so you've graduated from Cambridge, and we fast forward to April 2008, and you're elected president of the NUS. What was the driving force behind your kind of motivation to run for president of the NUS?
So I got involved in student politics at university. I hadn't actually intended to do that in a way. I was already a member of the Labour Party before I went to university, but I didn't really get involved in the Labour Club, partly because it kind of clashed with the big student union kind of club night, and so I'd go out with my friends instead. And there were some characters in the Labour Club while I was at university that didn't necessarily speak directly to me and my background and my politics. One of which, hilariously, was a guy called Tim Stanley, who is now a very right-wing commentator on the Telegraph, but when we're at university was like on the kind of hard left. So he's undergone quite a political journey. So I hadn't really got involved in party politics at university, but I was, ironically, especially given my Labour politics, the thing that drove me to get involved in politics at university was the Blair government and the introduction of university top-up fees. And I always feel very self-conscious saying this to a current undergraduate and you know, maybe some postgrads in the room, but certainly to a current undergraduate audience, I feel very self-conscious complaining about how terrible it was that the Labour government was increasing tuition fees from £1,000 to £3,000 and how outrageous £3,000 fees seem to be, you know, compared to what you guys have to pay now. I won't say too much more about that. But I basically thought it was wrong. I opposed tuition fees. I opposed the marketisation of universities. And at the time, the notion was of variable fees, and that we would, you know, see different universities charging different amounts. And when the Labour government increased fees to £3,000, when the Tory Liberal coalition increased them to £9,000, that variable tuition fee model never actually arose. But I didn't like the idea of different universities charging different amounts and price being a factor in students' choices about what to study, where to study, or whether to even study at all. So I actually got involved in student union campaigning on top-up fees and went on NUS demonstrations in London. And you know, despite the fact that I tried to suppress my inner political animal by becoming the JCR ENTS officer rather than one of the more political roles, when I was at Selwyn, I became JCR president, got involved in QSU, the university-wide students' union, became president of the students' union, and then Labour students kind of grabbed me at that point nationally and said, we need you to be more involved in Labour students nationally. And at the time, this is quite funny, if any of you who may be aware of my kind of current political positioning in the Labour Party, my reputation within the broader Labour Party, I was treated with some suspicion by Labour students who thought I was some kind of hard left trot infiltrator. because I was so opposed to the Labour government's policies on fees in Iraq, and they thought I'd been sent to infiltrate Labour students by the Campaign for Free Education. But I got involved in Labour students, got involved in NUS, and became NUS national president. And at the time, we had the fees review in the sort of the dying days of the Labour government. So my job was to try and get student representation on that review, and to try and stop the Labour Party from doing anything daft pre-2010 general election, and to sign up as many Labour parliamentary candidates, so that if we were still in government post-2010 general election, my hope was that there would be enough committed Labour rebels who had signed the now infamous NUS pledge to oppose any increase in tuition fees. My plan was to make sure that my successor as NUS president had a bank of Labour MPs who were ready to rebel, and to basically eliminate the Labour government's majority if they had one. When the Tories formed a coalition with the Lib Dems, I just kind of didn't think that the Brown review and the nine grand fees would happen, because I naively assumed that all of the Liberal Democrats who signed the NUS pledge, and actually gave me a hard time as NUS president, saying the pledge didn't go far enough and should have committed to free education. Obviously the Liberal Democrats broke the pledge and broke their party in the process. And the rest is history. But my job at that time was to kind of put students in as influential position as possible pre and post general election. We didn't do too bad a job at it. And certainly if there had been a minority Labour government or a Labour government return with a small majority, they would not have had the votes to increase tuition fees, because I had lots of Labour candidates, including people like Chuka Umunna, who at the time was perceived as being on the kind of soft left of the Labour Party. They'd all signed my NUS pledge and hopefully would have been bound by it.
So you were, okay, thank you. Whilst you were president of the NUS, because you were reported to have embraced the principle that students should pay tuition fees, and some even accused it of being to the right of the Liberal Democrats. So what's your stance on that then? Is that your position that can you clarify what kind of you were in favour when it came to tuition fees? No fees at all, varied fees depending on uni, and kind of following on from that, did you support the 2017-2019 manifesto pledges to abolish tuition fees altogether?
So it was a slightly tactical judgment, and it was partly a principled judgment. But we, and by we I mean not just me, but NUS and its membership, because ultimately this had to be agreed by the NUS conference and actually successive NUS conferences. We took a judgment on two fronts. One was that we were so far down the track on tuition fees that it was going to be pretty impossible to win a government position to the notion of scrapping any graduate contribution to the cost of undergraduate education. And my judgment was that we had a far better chance of persuading a future government to abolish tuition fees, which was always my goal, but to replace it with some form of graduate tax, which I found an attractive idea for two reasons. One is that it would remove the notion of tuition fees and the sticker price on courses, and the notion of variable fees and marketisation, so that no one would think twice about applying to university if they wanted to go based on what the fee was. Instead, it would be based purely on the notion of a time-limited graduate tax. So in the end, the amount you pay would be entirely contingent on what you earn, which is not too dissimilar to the repayment system we have now. But there are a number of important differences. One, there's no price attached to the course. And secondly, you wouldn't end up in this absurd position that you guys are in terms of eye-watering levels of interest and unfavourable repayment conditions, which have worsened since I was in NUS. And so that was the sort of pragmatic judgment was, well, we're not going to win free education, so we should stop banging on about it. We should try and instead win a fairer funding system, and we can scrap tuition fees, but we should accept the notion that graduates would pay for future generations to go to university. And that leads me on to the more principal point. despite all of the effort that's been made to widen participation in higher education, it is still generally the case that those people who go to university are more middle class and certainly go on to be among the higher earning members of our society. And I think there is a principled argument that says, why should people from low income backgrounds who do not have graduate earnings and graduate life chances subsidise those who do? And actually, I would rather spend money on things like council housing, income support, better education, and things that would improve the life chances of people from backgrounds like mine. So that's where we got to. I mean, the one that always gets cited on social media was an independent, I think it was an independent article, which the headline says, moving to the right on tuition fees makes sense, says NUS president. I mean, I never actually said that those words, and I don't support tuition fees, never have. And I certainly didn't see our position as a right-wing position. On the opposite, quite the opposite. I think there is a progressive case to be made for graduate contributions. In terms of the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn committed to scrapping tuition fees and having free universal higher education paid for through progressive taxation. And, you know, that's not a position I kind of opposed or kicked off about particularly. I don't think it was the most progressive policy in our manifesto. It was also the most expensive. And I would rather actually the billions of pounds that we committed to that were spent on improving the welfare system, improving housing support, and improving vocational and state education for everyone, rather than subsidising higher education for the middle classes. But as for what Labour's policy is in the future, that is very much not my remit, and I'll definitely stay in my lane and leave that to Keir and to Bridget, our Shadow Education Secretary. Okay, well, that leads me on to the next question. So fast forward to November 2021 and you find yourself appointed as Shadow Health Secretary. Do you consider the current Shadow Cabinet to be a government in waiting? Yeah, I do, and I think we show that more and more. We're not complacent about it. What do the polls show us at the moment? It tells us that people are absolutely sick and tired of Boris Johnson and his lies and his deceit, and the fact that you can always tell when Boris Johnson's lying is because his lips are moving, and that's presumably why he chose to wear a face mask in his interview this week. I think that Johnson is now like toxic waste and radioactive, so the longer the Tories cling on to him, the greater the chances of radiation sickness affecting his entire party. But we're not complacent, and it's not good enough for the Tories to just lose the next general election. Labour needs to win the next general election, and we'll do that by winning back trust. But when you compare our people and our policies and our values, I think Labour can go into the next general election in a confident, self-confident way. And I think one of the things Keir's leadership has done is give the Labour Party back its self-confidence and self-respect. And I think he can do the same for our country as a whole. In Keir Starmer, you've got someone who, you know, a comparison between Keir and Boris is like the difference between night and day. In Keir, you've got someone who is honest and decent. In Boris Johnson, you have someone who has been throughout his career a continual liar. You've got someone in Keir who has given his life to public service, and Boris Johnson who's devoted himself to self-service. So you then look at the sort of a broader offer in terms of policies, and take the current challenge on cost of living, for example, where people are seeing their energy bills rocket and are struggling to pay. We've come up with an offer that would give everyone support with their energy bills, with £200 a year off their energy bills, which would apply to everyone. But we would give people from the lowest income backgrounds and pensioners an additional £400, so they'd see £600 off their energy bills, which is a substantial amount of money. We'd pay for that using a windfall tax on oil and gas, who are doing very well out of the energy crisis, and energy price rises. And so you then get a position where Tory ministers appear on the telly, like Nadhim Zahawi did last week, who, by the way, has pocketed quite a lot of money from the oil and gas industry over the years, saying that we can't possibly charge a windfall tax on oil and gas companies because they're struggling. I mean, get real. Like, the idea that oil and gas companies are struggling and families are not, but it's outrageous. But this is the difference between Labour and the Conservatives in terms of our values and our instincts and where we want to try and help people. And it applies more broadly. I mean, the Tories are clobbering working people with tax rises again and then again and again. We've said we would go after people who earn or receive money through things like shares, dividends, property assets, in order to properly fund public services. In the area that I'm responsible for, the NHS, the Tories will say, oh, the reason we've got NHS waiting lists at record levels of 6 million is because we've got a pandemic, haven't you noticed? And that partly accounts for it. I wouldn't say the pandemic isn't putting pressure on the NHS, of course not. But that doesn't explain why we went into the pandemic with NHS waiting lists already at a record 4.5 million, 100,000 NHS staff vacancies, 112,000 vacancies in social care, which adds pressure onto the NHS. And since the Tories came to power in 2010, the uptake of private healthcare has doubled. And in fact, I've just seen this afternoon an email come in from a member of the public telling me that, and he sent me an email from his GP saying the waiting time for his routine appointment is so long, would he consider going private? And would he like his GP to prefer him to a private provider? I mean, this is the backdoor privatisation of the NHS. So I feel more confident about the Labour Party and its ability to win the next general election than I have done for a very long time. Even in the run-up to 2010, I didn't feel particularly confident that Labour would win the next general election. I feel more confident now than at any point since before the 2005 general election that Labour can win. But we're not complacent, we're not cocky, we're not arrogant about it. We know we've got a lot of work to do to win back trust. But under Keir's leadership, with the team that we've got, with the values we've got, with the policies we've got, I think we can do it.
So you've touched on some important issues there, which have allowed me to cross off a lot of the questions I had. But what I did want to loop back to is you spoke about Boris Johnson there. The Labour Party, including yourself, have called for him to resign. One of the favourables to replace him is Rishi Sunak. So with Rishi Sunak's favourables at 40% and Keir Starmer's at only 33%, doesn't it make sense for Labour to not want the Prime Minister to go, to stay put, destroy the party and give you a clear sweep of it at 2023?
Yeah, three answers to that. One is, first and foremost, of course, we're calling for Boris Johnson to resign. The guy has lied regularly and repeatedly and broken the rules in a national pandemic, treated the public with contempt, undermined public confidence in his own health measures at a critical moment in the pandemic. And I think if Boris Johnson is able to survive this, it reflects very poorly on our political system. We do not want to end up in a position where people can knowingly lie and mislead the House of Commons and get away with it. So I would hope that Conservative MPs would have enough self-respect, if not a sense of national duty, to remove a leader who is clearly unfit for public office. That's the first thing. Secondly, though Boris Johnson's dire poll ratings might be beneficial to the Labour Party, ultimately we do care about good governance in this country and we'd rather have a Prime Minister who's up to the job. So whether or not it's in our interests or not, we want Boris Johnson out. And the third thing is, I don't fear some of Boris Johnson's potential successors as much as some of the media commentariat do. Take Rishi Sunak, who is more like the invisible man than the Chancellor. He does huge disappearing acts for prolonged periods of time while business and industry suffers. And we saw that before Christmas when he tried to get in an early holiday in the run up to Christmas by jetting off to California, talking to some US healthcare providers, negotiating goodness knows what, I dread to think, and then thought he could kind of disappear off to one of his many houses, this one in California, and do a bit of chillaxing before Christmas. Honestly, I work with Gordon Brown. I know Gordon Brown very well. The idea that Gordon Brown as Chancellor, let alone Prime Minister, would put his feet up in the middle of a national crisis when companies are going to the wall and businesses, in the hospitality and aviation industries in particular, were crying out for support is just unthinkable. So the crisis in the Conservative Party and their unfitness for office extends well beyond Boris Johnson, I'm afraid. The other thing is Rishi Sunak, in terms of the qualities you need in a prime minister, as well as being relatively untested, I think he's just completely lacking in emotional intelligence and tone deaf. When he did bother to pop up from his trip to California, he did a completely ridiculous video. It wasn't even a news interview where you kind of think, well, he's put on the spot. This was a communications output that clearly he and his team planned, where despite the fact businesses were going to the wall and he was in California and they weren't able to get hold of him, he popped up and was like, oh, hi guys, so we've got this wonderful business package and it's going to do this, 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 and this. Isn't that just great? And I'm going to speak to you like children. Great. If that's the big risk, if that's the next Conservative Prime Minister, they can knock themselves out. We look forward to taking on Rishi Sunak at the next general election. And the rest of the cast of the cabinet are no better. One of the fascinating things about Boris Johnson and the way he leads the Conservative Party is that so much of the talent in the Conservative Party that you could objectively look at and say, these are serious people, these are their kind of star players, they're not in the cabinet, they're in the lower ranks or they're on the back benches, because Boris Johnson surrounded himself with people who aren't very good because he doesn't like to be challenged. So it's not just that we've got a poor prime minister, we've got a poor cabinet, and that doesn't actually help the Conservative Party in the longer term. But I'm not crying about that.
Okay, so my final question, because I want to allow some people in the room to come and ask you a question. Earlier this month, the New Statesman tagged you as a future leader of the Labour Party. You're a rising star in the party. You've been making headlines and doing the Sunday morning rounds. So do you see the leadership of the party in sight for you at any point?
Peter's sniggering now in the background. I hate this, to be honest, because in Westminster, being called a kind of rising star or future leader, he's kind of creeping around. What are you now going to say?
I want to say to you all, isn't it exciting that we're a party that's got so many vibrant, ambitious, intelligent, successful people, that people are talking about the vibrancy of our party and the next leaders, including this one.
Right, get lost now. He does this all the time. Do you know, I did an interview with Parliament's House magazine, which is our in-house magazine, and Peter heckled all the way through, to the extent that when you look at the write-up, you'd think it was a joint interview. And I've made the terrible mistake of continuing to share an office with Pete, even though having been MPs for 6.5 years, we were eligible for an upgrade, and now having both been in the shadow cabinet, Peter's the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, we'd be eligible for our own bigger offices, but we've chosen to stick together because we're good friends with similar politics. No, look, being called like rising star future leader in Westminster is a curse as much as it's a compliment, to be honest. And one of the things that I always think about when you kind of see things like that said or written is when I think about some of the people who've been called rising stars in the Labour Party in recent years, or future leaders. A whole load of them aren't even Labour MPs anymore, let alone in a position to run to be leader of Labour. Some of them aren't even members of the Labour Party anymore. So I kind of take that all with a pinch of salt, to be honest. As much as I said earlier, I'm a pretty precocious person. I'm pretty driven and unapologetic about being ambitious, and spend loads of time telling working class kids in my constituency that they should be ambitious for themselves. I'm also a really strong team player as well, and I have a lot of faith and confidence in Keir, and would never kind of disrespect him by kind of touting myself as a potential successor. It's my job to put my shoulder to the wheel and to make sure we've got a Labour government and I'm the next health secretary. And as for the future beyond that, I'm a historian by undergraduate degree, and I think that so much of politics is about luck and timing as much as it's about ability and skill. So who knows what the future holds, but if you'd asked me 5 years ago, would I be Shadow Health Secretary in a Keir Starmer-led Labour Party, I would not have taken that for granted. In fact, after the 2019 general election defeat, I would not have taken for granted that Keir Starmer would be leader of the Labour Party. So I've never known politics to be as turbulent and unpredictable as this at any point in our history. So you have to just see where the tides take you, I guess.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much. If I am correct, we have about 10 minutes, if that's okay with you, for questions from the audience here. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. Yeah, sure. Do you want to, I don't know if you want to speak a bit closer.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Kieran. You can't actually see me on camera. But basically, I was quite interested in another topic. Recently in the press, you've been talking a lot about needing to win hearts and minds. And so I come from quite a conservative area that used to be Labour since after 2005. And I think the sad reality is they're not necessarily just going to change their minds about Labour because we change the image. I think really we need to persuade them of the policies and like simply changing the policies we do. So recently there's been quite a rightward shift, I would say, in what policies are being pursued by Labour, whether you agree with that or not. I don't think simply changing the policies is going to do what the strategy looks like. So I was just interested in how you, or what your justification was for saying that winning hearts and minds is about building trust rather than persuasion necessarily. Yeah.
I think the two things go hand in hand. I think you're right, by the way, in terms of sort of the underlying assumptions that you make. What the Labour Party can't do is just a bit of superficial rebranding and saying, look, the bloke at the top has changed, we're new now and we've got different shadow cabinet, vote for us. That doesn't work, especially when the core brand damage inflicted on the Labour Party that led us to our worst defeat since 1935 was so severe. You have to show the country that you've changed, how you've changed, and crucially that you believe in the change. I think the same challenge that's existed for all Labour oppositions is that people tend to assume that our heart's in the right place and that we're the party of public services, we're the party of equality, we're the party of tackling burning injustices in our society. I think people generally know that about the Labour Party and they know that's kind of what we stand for. They tend to want reassurance on three things. Can we trust you with our money? Can we trust you with law and order? Can we trust you with our national security? And that drives me up the wall, actually, because when you look at Labour's post-war history, I think we've got a very proud record on all three of those things. I could make a very good, well-evidenced case that Labour governments are better at managing the economy than Conservative governments. In fact, even if you exclude the recent pandemic and the impact on the economy and just look at pre-pandemic growth data under the Tories, and you compare it to the last Labour government, including the financial crisis, growth was higher under the last Labour government than under the Conservatives. And what does that mean? It means that we could invest huge amounts in public services without clobbering working people with tax rises. And going back to my point about Rishi the Golden Boy earlier, why is Rishi a high tax chancellor? Because the Conservatives have been a low growth government, and he's high taxes because he's low growth. And so, but that doesn't matter because perception is 9/10 of the law in politics. The perception is Labour's weaker on the economy. So we have to continue to make those arguments about being trusted with money, telling people what our priorities are, reassuring them that we will tax fairly, spend wisely, and get the economy going for growth. On law and order, I think we had a very proud record, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. We invested more in policing, more in the criminal justice system. Court waits were lower, sentencing was pretty tough, but also we invested in tackling those conditions that lead to people committing crime in the first place. You might know, we haven't touched on it yet, but two of my grandparents have spent time in prison. My mum was born in prison. One of my granddads has a string of convictions for armed robbery because he was a regular armed robber, but as it turns out from his convictions, not a very successful one, and he got caught most of the time. Although I don't believe in making excuses for people and you have to take responsibility for yourself, there are lots of reasons why, in terms of his experience in childhood and growing up and the hardship experience, lots of reasons why he turned to crime. So if you tackle the causes of crime, you end up with fewer criminals, a safer society, and everyone's a winner. And on defence, I mean, we got such a proud record. It was a Labour government that secured the nuclear deterrent, that helped to found NATO, which has been the cornerstone of our national security and Western defence for not far off a century now. So I think we've got a strong historical record on those three things. But as I say, perception's 9/10 of the law, so you have to face the future and talk about the future and have a convincing argument to make to the country on those fronts. And as for whether or not, and this is the thing I think is misunderstood, particularly on parts of the left, my sort of political position as someone on the centre left is certainly further to the right than Jeremy Corbyn, and objectively so. But I think it stands in a proud mainstream Labour tradition that has existed since our party was first created, and since the trade unions and the socialist societies and the cooperative movement decided it wasn't enough just to march in protest against those in power for our rights and our freedoms and social justice. It was the mission to engage in the compromises and the difficult choices of government, to become elected and to walk the corridors of power as a governing party, and and as a party that served the interests of the working classes. And I think I stand in that same proud Labour tradition, the same tradition that has delivered Labour in every single government, from Attlee through to Wilson through to Blair. Every single election victory has been won in broadly that centre-left ground. So I would absolutely accept the characterisation that the Labour Party is to the right of Jeremy Corbyn, but it's still very much on the left of politics and in that mainstream left tradition that wins power. And the final thing I would say about the difference between the culture in the Labour Party now and when we win versus where we've been in recent years is that sometimes on the left I find people love nothing more than to revel in their own self-righteousness and tell the British people how disappointed we are that the voters don't live up to our high expectations as a puritanical left-wing social society. That for me is not serious politics, and that's not how you win elections. I think the Labour Party has kind of got its act together in recent years and shows it wants to win again.
Okay, does anyone have any other questions? If not, yeah, sure, go. No, go.
Hi guys, thank you very much for being with us. I wanted to ask you a quick question about the new shadow cabinet, of which you are a member. We've had a few shadow cabinets, and after this November reshuffle, this new one was seemingly touted, unlike the previous ones, as being uniquely well suited for governments. Now we had a team that was ready for government. And I'm just curious what you think was wrong with the previous, without naming names, what was wrong with the previous shadow cabinets that didn't quite click, and what it is specifically about this shadow cabinet that you think makes it a better place to govern.
What's changed? I think, firstly, I think it has been a real strength for the Labour Party that people who've got experience within government have been brought into the shadow cabinet. You've got Yvette Cooper, who was in the Brown cabinet and served in a kind of frontline opposition role under Ed Miliband, and then was a very successful chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who brings a wealth of experience of government into the shadow cabinet. Pat McFadden, who worked in Number 10 at the heart of Tony Blair's Downing Street, and then ran the business department in Gordon Brown's cabinet, in the shadow cabinet, bringing a huge amount of experience and credibility with him. I think Rachel Reeves' appointment as Shadow Chancellor has been a real success. I think she's an impactful politician and is a model, I think, for to kind of follow in terms of having some cut through and landing blows on the Tories. I mean, I thought her response to the budget when Keir had to isolate and she sort of had to respond with barely an hour's notice, I think showed that she's an accomplished economist by training, but also an accomplished politician. You've got some newer people like myself and Bridget Phillipson, who are younger, haven't served in government, but do bring a life experience into the shadow cabinet. We're both from very similar backgrounds, actually, in terms of our upbringing in working class communities. And I think, from my own point of view, I think one of the perspectives I bring, Peter Carl, who you've briefly seen, brings is experience of beating Tories and understanding how that you win Tory voters over to voting Labour. So I think we got the right people in the right positions now, and I think that's kind of bearing fruit in terms of the ways in which the Tories fear us now, but also there's some evidence that we're having an impact on polling. But we've got a lot to do. I mean, I don't know when the last poll was done on this, but for example, I imagine my numbers would be slightly better now. But when I was first appointed as Shadow Health Secretary, I think my name recognition, before you even think about favourability ratings, was something like 6%. I imagine I feel like I've never been off the telly, to be honest, since I became Shadow Health Secretary. There's always something that goes on every day in health. But I imagine my name recognition's gone up, but there's a lot of work to do because, and even highly visible members of the cabinet, let alone the shadow cabinet, you don't get kind of universal name recognition. Most people tune into politics for a few minutes each week, if you're lucky. So we've got to think, in those few minutes that people are tuning in, what are they seeing and what are they hearing from the Labour Party, and how does that make them feel? Because crucially, when it comes to news and politics, yes, people make judgments based on values and policies and people, but it's also about how you make them feel and what do they take away from an interview? Do they see someone on the TV who they think looks and sounds credible? Are they saying something that you agree with? Is there a policy that catches their imagination? Because even if they don't quite remember what that policy was or what that line was that they heard, they will remember the fact that they saw someone from the Labour Party on the telly and it made them think, oh yeah, they look like they know what they're talking about. So it's a hard slog, kind of winning power back from opposition. And Labour oppositions have always underestimated it, which is why we end up in being out of the government for so long whenever we're in opposition, because the Labour Party unlearns very quickly how hard it was to win a general election the previous time round. So, you know, I think we're in a better position than we've been for a long time. But those of us who are now in the shadow cabinet also kind of carry a heavy responsibility and can't be cocky or complacent or arrogant about it. So that's what I kind of keep in mind whenever I'm doing telly or radio, is I've got to talk to those voters that we're trying to win back, and you know, make sure that I'm saying things that reassure them that we're on their side, that we've got a sense of their priorities and that we share their priorities and have genuine answers to them.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it on our first event of 2022. Thank you for answering all of our questions.
That's all right. Sorry it's virtual, and I hope that, and I actually feel pretty confident at the moment to end on a cheery note. I kind of do think that things are going to start getting better on this front, and that hopefully your student experience will feel more normal. Because I actually feel really sorry for people who've been at school, college, university during the pandemic, because I think it's had a real impact on studies. And going back to what I was saying earlier about obstacles and resilience, I mean, in the end, I think, although it's not been a pleasant experience, I do think that there's a lot of respect for your generation who've had to go through education with the level of disruption that you've had, and the way you've kind of come through it will stand you in good stead for the rest of your careers. So I hope that's some small consolation, but I also hope things get better for you sooner rather than later, and that you enjoy the rest of the year.
Well, thank you very much. It was great to meet you, and take care. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me along.